Today is May 22nd, 2018, and we are here with Attorney Bruce Carver Boynton for a follow-up session. This is part 2 of a 2-part oral history. The first part was last Friday, May the 18th, 2018, and we're going to continue where we left off at the end of that session. Good morning, Mr. Boynton.
Good morning.
One of the parts of your background that we did not have a lot of time to spend on last week was your education background. And if it's okay, I did want to go back and cover a couple of questions related to that, because I know you were a student of history.
Yes.
And as we noted last time, you graduated high school very early at the age of 14 and ended up graduating college from Fisk University at the age of 18. What was it that brought you to make the decision to attend college at Fisk University?
Well, actually, at the time that I finished high school, I was uncertain where I wanted to go, but my parents wanted me to go to Tuskegee Institute, their alma mater. Actually, it was because they had attended Tuskegee. There is an aunt in Montgomery who was the home demonstration agent for Montgomery County, who was a Tuskegee graduate, and an aunt who taught at Hale County Training School in Greensboro, who was a Tuskegee graduate. And Tuskegee was the headquarters for both parents and for my aunt, that they frequently went to Tuskegee for something in connection with their work. So I got to know everybody, and it would not be like going away from home. I wanted to go a distance where I could be considered away from home, but nevertheless close enough in case I wanted to come back. So Nashville, Tennessee and Fisk University seemed to have fit that pattern. And additionally, there was one friend of my mother who was a Fisk graduate, a doctor's wife, and she pointed out that Fisk University had a basic college program, and that they enrolled students who were brilliant, or very smart, from the 10th grade through the 12th grade, where they would not have to go 4 years of college. They would go 5 years, but because they were early entrants, they had that advantage of just being smart. Actually, it was thought that I would associate with them, but I consider myself to be a straight freshman and not one of the young basic college students.
Now, you decided to study history there and majored in history. What led to your choice there?
Well, and that was an interesting choice, because I really wanted to be a doctor at the time, and I started off in the pre-med curriculum. It was 17 hours of some very solid education scientifically. I had 5 hours of chemistry and lab, 4 hours of solid geometry, or 5 hours solid geometry. And the first week of a chemistry class with a German professor, he gave us an examination. I guess to inform him of where each one of the students were in advanced or not advanced in chemistry. I had only had one semester of chemistry, and I only learned how to make sulfuric acid. And actually, I had one semester of physics, which the professor never taught physics because the English teacher went to the hospital on her yearly birth of a child. He taught us English. I think he figured that there were many of us in class who would never rely upon physics, but we did need to be able to speak a correct sentence grammatically to say that we were high school graduates. But the test was given in the chemistry class, and I was sitting down on the front row of the lecture hall that was elevated. And I was writing with a pencil. And I noticed that I didn't hear anybody else writing. The pencil would make a sound on the paper, but I turned around and looked up behind me, and I saw everybody with this thing looked like a ruler, and they were manipulating it. I didn't even know what a slide rule was while they were busy sliding me out. But I quickly learned that I didn't have a background for Fisk University's pre-med program, and I then enrolled as a history major.
How did your history studies shape your perspective on some of the events that you were a part of and some of the events that were going on at the time?
Well, the fortunate thing is that I had only one professor for all of my history classes. He was considered to be a great history professor, and he was. He could claim as his student from Fisk, John Hope Franklin, but he also claimed Rudy Valet as one of his students. That was, of course, before he left the East and came to Nashville to teach. But I got a good foundation in what America was all about. And also from a Native American point of view, because I have that in my ancestry. But I had, I suppose, what I saw and experienced as a history major, things that shaped my whole outlook in life.
And I know part of that outlook included some studies on the Doctrine of Discovery and the implications that had. I wondered if you could talk some on
yes.
that.
The Doctrine of Discovery, which I, in later years as a practicing attorney, got a chance to involve myself in much more because of my involvement with the Native Americans in Phoenix, Arizona. But I was, and incidentally, I guess this is a good way of explaining the doctrine too. I was requested by the Native Americans in Phoenix if I could involve myself in the black community there in Phoenix to cause the blacks to become supportive of the problems that the Native Americans were facing. The reason why is the very beginning of the black people's problems in Africa for colonialism and slavery, slave trade, was also the exact problem that the Native Americans faced after Christopher Columbus came, and resulting in the loss of the great turtle, which they refer to that being the United States, the property that they owned and the land that they owned. Well, the Doctrine of Discovery basically began in 1454 when the Pope gave to the Portuguese king the right to go into Africa and seize it as a colony, the people as slaves, and to take in and all personal property or minerals. Of course, when Columbus discovered America in 1492, and the doctrine was extended at that time to all of the monarchs of European countries, which at that time we have to remember the Catholic Reformation had not occurred, and therefore there were no Protestant rulers, all were Catholic, and the doctrine went to give them authority, as the King of Portugal had, to do anything it cared to with not only Africa, but any discovered country or land that was not already being ruled by a European monarch. So that opened up the whole world, really, to colonialism. As a matter of fact, that was done in the late 1800s, when the widespread act of colonialism came about. It even extended to the Asian countries and the Middle East. The Middle East, because specifically, and the doctrine was worded, that the authorities, the monarchs, were to take the land of Muslims. And that explains how they got into the Middle East and became the boss of those areas. So I recognize that as being perhaps the first example of institutionalized white racism, white supremacy, to give the European monarchs this type of authority. over non-whites.
Mr. Boynton, in addition to your studies of history at Fisk University, I know you also studied foreign language, which led to a story of a theater incident that I wanted to ask you to recount, if you don't mind.
Oh, that is right. Well, I had several incidents of seeking to break the law of segregated public facilities. And one occurred at Fisk when there was a movie, I can recall now, it starred Sidney Poitier in Blackboard Jungle. And we wanted to see it being played at a downtown movie where the whites sat on the first floor, blacks sat in the balcony. But we didn't want to subject ourselves to being segregated. So what we did was to organize a group of us to go to the movie. We had 2 or 3 whites because Fisk had always maintained having a white enrollment either on a permanent basis or as exchange students from other universities across the country. But we got 2 or 3 other white students, and there were about 6 of us blacks. And we all conversed on the ticket booth at the same time, and each one of us spoke a language that we had taken in college, there at Fisk. For example, I spoke German, but by us speaking in tongue with all of these languages, it confused the ticket seller, who just assumed that we were all from a foreign country, and she sold us tickets. And we sat downstairs and enjoyed the movie at the time.
From Fisk University, you proceeded to law school at Howard University, and we touched on your years there last Friday, but I wanted to ask a more specific question. Did you have a favorite professor there, and what were some of your favorite parts of law school?
Oh, I suppose that one of my favorite professors was the one who taught me freshman or first year, first year federal procedure. He was a person by the name of Charles Duncan. And beside him being an excellent professor who relayed the problems that we found in the course very well, Charlie was a unique person. He had been the subject, along with his family, of a movie that it had been made in Hollywood after World War II, probably released about 1947 or 48. The title of the movie was Lost Boundaries. And in it, and this was based on an actual occurrence based on fact. But in the movie, Charlie had attended Dartmouth for his undergrad studies. His father was named Todd Duncan, And he had performed on Broadway with the play, Gershwin's play, Porgy and Bess. As a matter of fact, he played in the title role of Porgy. And at the time that Charlie was at Dartmouth, he became friends of a white classmate. I think he was perhaps his roommate, but they were close friends. So much so that the friend decided that he should go home with him for Christmas. So he wrote his family and told him that he wanted his roommate to come to visit along with him for the holidays, and they agreed. Now, the problem was that his parents were black, but they had been passing for white. As a matter of fact, the father was the town doctor, highly respected, and they have lived a comfortable life passing. When Charlie, who was identifiably black, showed up with their friend, their son rather, then all conniption fits occurred because they were positive that by his presence, it would indicate to the community in some type of way that they were not white, but were members of the black race. And the movie went on and on that. It ended up with a happy ending, but I've forgotten right now what it was. But occasionally, the movie is shown on Ted Turner channel. So if one remembers that the title of the picture was Lost Boundaries, you can catch that movie, perhaps even shown nowadays. But I thought that we had a very good relationship, and I will remember him forever.
I know you had good relationships with your classmates as well. Your class started with 60, but graduated with only 30, so a fairly
Right.
high attrition rate, I believe.
Right. I think the school was happy to be able to eliminate some of the students.
That was, law school was different by the time I got there, but it was harsh historically. We covered quite a bit on Friday about
Now,
the.
incidentally, let me say this
Yes, sir.
on that subject. There was a saying that one of the teaching professors adopted to us first-year students at the very early days of the classes starting. He said he wanted everybody to look to their left and then look to their right, because by the end of the semester, one of you all will be gone.
I know you spent some time in Philadelphia over the summers during law school, but ultimately after graduating, after making it through those cuts and graduating from Howard, you returned home and took the Alabama bar. Was there a temptation at any point to stay up north after you graduated?
No, not really. I think the closest that I came to considering practicing in Philadelphia is that I had difficulty getting jobs, even though I was seeking some employment, not on a permanent basis, but something commensurate with my education. And I often went to someone who was a practicing lawyer and asked them if they could make a suggestion of where I might go to apply for work that would not be working in a restaurant or something of the sort. I ended up with a attorney, Cecil Moore. Cecil is a very outstanding criminal lawyer, and we became close friends. Close friends because he had broken the will of I can't remember his first name now, but his last name was Gerard, who was a seafaring captain who made enough money to establish a white university for white males. And that's the way that his will specified. And Cecil said that ain't a will that can't be broke. Ain't a will that can be broke. Ain't a will that can't be broke. And he broke that will for the admission of blacks. And as I said, he and I became very good friends. And I did consider at one time of remaining in Philadelphia and practicing with Cecil. But I recognized that my family, mother and father, were fighting for equal rights for blacks here in Alabama, and that they had paved my way for college and law school to help them. So I did not seriously consider it for just a minute.
Now, when you did come home to take the Alabama bar, we noted on Friday that the same day you sat for the bar was the date that the United States Supreme Court granted cert in your Supreme Court case.
That is true.
What we did not note is that in the midst of all that going on, when you took the bar, you got the second highest score in the state. And I think that's an important thing to note here. Your application, though, wound up being upheld for a number of years after you took the exam.
For 6 years, but actually, when I took the examination on the first day and the Supreme Court granted cert, the local news and everybody carried that occurrence. And also, the students at Alabama State University, which is a black school here in Montgomery, went down to the county courthouse to protest an all-white lunch counter there in the courthouse itself. So that was in the news. And I had not mentioned that I was appealing the case because I did not write that I had intentionally gone into the white restaurant on my application. But they did investigate my arrest at the time that everyone else got notice of if they passed or failed the bar. I got a telegram stating that they were going to investigate the circumstances surrounding my arrest. And that investigation took place for 6 years. And actually, I got my license for the state of Alabama, primarily because Congress had passed the important racial integration laws, the Voting Rights Act, the Public Accommodation Law. And they thought that there was no longer any need to keep me out, that they had lost on all fields of battle. Therefore, I came down and got my license in 1966. January the 1st, 1966 is the date that my license were issued.
And,
That's up.
well, I was just gonna, before getting to 1966, if it's okay, go back to what you were doing meanwhile, which was you went to Tennessee, also passed the Tennessee bar exam, and there was a story, I believe, regarding your admission ultimately in Tennessee.
Oh, yes, which is symbolic of the problems that my parents would have been facing all the while and what I also faced at that time. But I got notice that I had passed the bar in Nashville. And then several weeks or a couple of months later, I got a call from the president of the Tennessee bar that he had received a letter from the Dallas County Bar Association, which is in Selma, my hometown. And he thought that there were some problems that the letter presented and suggested that I come to Nashville and meet with him at his home. My parents and I did do such a thing by meeting with him on a Saturday at his farm. He was a very congenial person, and we met him, played chess, but I wanted to know more about the letter that he had received, and I asked him finally, what about the letter? He said, well, not to worry about it, that we use the term we, had considered the letter, and it was written in such racist terms that we decided to ignore it, and you will be admitted with everyone else on the date of admission. I asked to see the letter, and he said that he didn't have it there at his home, but I did ask him, what did it say? And he said, well, one of the things that it said was that they considered you and your father to be arrogant niggers. And with that, they ignored the rest of it because it was obviously a racist letter. So I got my license from the state of Tennessee.
And you proceeded to practice in Chattanooga, and I thought that it was worth noting that I believe one of the types of cases you handled there was representing teenagers who would go to the local theater,
Yes.
as you had during your time at Fisk University.
Well, that is true. I was representing some young people who were demonstrating against an all-white theater in downtown Chattanooga. Actually, it was done at a time when there were sit-in demonstrations occurring all over the South, and they were being arrested beaten, and otherwise made to feel uncomfortable. And the students, the high school students who comprised the protesters for the movie theaters had a fashion of protest that did not cause them to be arrested. They formed a circular line, and the one closest to the booth would go up and offer his money and be denied a ticket. He then would go to the rear of the line, and the next one would do the same thing, and they were repeating that all through the protest. Well, the city said that as long as they don't break the law, they're not going to be arrested. There was one recent high school graduate by the name of Willie Ricks. And Willie, who later became the Minister of Defense for Stokely Carmichael, and I have a large picture of Stokely, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Willie Ricks marching together. But he was Minister of Defense for Stokely Carmichael, and frequently comes to Selma. So I still see Willie now, but he really was my first client, or these kids were my first client. And I was called in to defend them when they decided that they would do something that would cause them to be arrested. So Willie had them to line up across the sidewalk, thereby causing all white sidewalk walkers to then have to walk in the gutter. And they were then arrested in the presence of two newspaper reporters, the morning and the afternoon reporters, and a local television news camera. So there was no question, no doubt about what they did and the resulting arrest. Well, when we went to city court on the charge of obstructing the sidewalk, the courtroom was packed with black spectators. Actually, I had come to Chattanooga to replace a black attorney, the only one in town, who had died after many years of practice and everything. But I was a replacement for him, so to speak. And I determined that the people who were sitting in the audience had come to observe me and the way I would defend these kids as much as to observe how they were defended. Well, the sergeant who ordered the arrest of the kids testified what the kids did, what he saw them do, and he then picked up his notebook and said that he ordered and started to read off the names of the defendants and that they were arrested. Well, I stopped him with an objection. And my objection came because I didn't know how I would defend the case until a quiet voice spoke to me, and the voice said, "Bruce, don't you know that to white people, all black people look alike?" So my objection was for him to identify the person with the name of the arrestee, which he couldn't do. So for each one that he called out and then was unable to identify who that was, I had a motion to dismiss. And it was everybody who was dismissed except Willie Ricks, because Willie had been arrested so many times as a sit-ender or other areas of protest that actually he was being supported by the NAACP of Chattanooga, but they were afraid that with his frequent arrests, he would soon break the bail bond account of the organization. But that led that case, because I had on appeal the arrest of Willie Ricks, and that case led to something that I'm very proud of that occurred. And that was that I had a close friend who was a lawyer, and he had been a state senator at the time that Brown versus Board of Education was decided. And he made public statements typically of all the white office holders who reacted in their southern way to the decision of the United States Supreme Court that your little white girl would come home with black babies and all of that. At the time that he became my friend, he no longer felt that way. He genuinely had rejected all of those type of statements. But he wanted to run for mayor of the city against a office holder who had been in office for 18 years. He asked me what would I charge to be a co-campaign manager for his campaign. I told him that my charge would be that he, if elected, would put me out of business of representing kids on matters such as what they were arrested on. He said that he would. Actually, we had a campaign and election that I was very active in, and we won. Very shortly after that, he not only integrated the city, but he and his wife, I had taken in a partner, and his wife and my first wife, all 6 of us attended a formerly all-white movie to see the motion picture, How the West Was Won. That was symbolic of the fact that Chattanooga was now a desegregated city. Actually, everything, all public facilities were desegregated, except the public schools were still being appealed and some things by the Board of Education. We had elementary schools desegregated, but it was sort of like having to climb a mountain. with the rest of the schools. But, and also, the one place that wasn't immediately desegregated was the wrestling matches, because he thought that it would take some time for the viewers who went to a wrestling match to become adjusted. And I had no objection about those two grounds. But I am very happy that that was done 2 years before Congress passed the Public Accommodation Act. So we desegregated a city, won Look Magazine's All-American City Award, and that was done while the rest of the state of Tennessee practiced racial segregation.
I believe Mayor Ralph Kelly was the mayor who you helped
Yes,
to get elected.
That was a person.
During those years in Chattanooga, I believe you also continued to have some ongoing contact with the attorney who had represented you in your United States Supreme Court appeal, future Justice Thurgood Marshall. And I thought I'd ask you to speak to that.
Oh, yes. Well, I have mentioned that school desegregation case against the Chattanooga Board of Education was ongoing. And the black lawyer who died had been the local lawyer who filed the lawsuit. I came in and replaced him, which allowed for the out-of-state attorneys for the plaintiffs to continue in the case, which was Thurgood Marshall and Constant Baker Motley. Connie Motley became a federal district court judge for the District of New York City. And they would, in in New York City, they would draft the pleadings that would be relevant to the case, mail them to me. I then would file the pleadings with the court, and with an extra copy, one for myself and a copy for the newspaper reporter, I would give him his copy. Well, that's the way it went for about 3 months. And I really felt like I was a spear carrier in an opera, because I really didn't do any of the work on the pleadings. But I thought that since I was in court every time that we had court, and I'm filing the pleadings, I am one of the lawyers, therefore I should be paid. So I sent a bill to Thurgood, and I didn't hear from anyone. The weeks came and went, and I didn't hear anything. So I got on the telephone, and I called to New York, and Constant Motley answered the telephone, and I said I was calling because I had submitted a bill and I hadn't received any money. She said, well, Mr. Marshall is right here. I'll give him the phone. And Thurgood came on, and he said, yes, Boynton. I said, Mr. Marshall, I submitted you all a bill, and I haven't received any pay. He says, how much was the bill for? I said, $5,000. He said, well, I tell you what we're going to do. You submit us bills that you want, and we'll submit you a check for the amount of money that you're going to get. And he submitted a check for $3,000. with which I bought my first car. So I really appreciate being a co-counsel of Thurgood Marshall.
Now, while you were living and working in Chattanooga, Tennessee, I know that you did not disconnect from Selma, obviously because of your parents, but also in your own activities, you remained very involved. And there was one incident in around 1963 while you were living in Chattanooga where a judge in Alabama signed an order to enjoin a long list of people from being allowed to gather, I believe. And I wanted to ask you to tell that story, if you don't mind,
Right.
and your role in responding to that.
Well, I would come home to do whatever I could with my mother and father. And one time I was there in Selma, and I was in the company of a lawyer who became very prominent, Attorney J.L. Chestnut, who had been in law school one class ahead of mine. But the time that we were together on this day, a deputy sheriff came along and served us with injunctions. This is in '63 when there had been, of course, the Freedom Riders, the lunch counter sit-ins, but things had then changed to voting registration demonstrations. It had not developed in Selma that there was any mass demand for blacks to become registered voters. My father had been active. In '63, he had suffered a heart attack, or rather a stroke. And he then was in the nursing home, completely paralyzed on his left side. But my father, to give you an idea of just how intense he was on the issue of voting, everyone who was an adult who passed my father's room at the nursing home, he would call out a question: "Are you a registered voter?" And because there had not been any widespread, there, outside of what my mother and some of her group would do, there had not been any widespread mass meetings or anything of the sort. The purpose of the injunctions, now we had never received any notice of a lawsuit, never received any notice of a lawsuit. These were just flat out injunctions that we were enjoined from being in the company of more than 3 persons. And that was rather amazing, to say the least. But it was designed to enjoin everybody black in the town of Selma who might possibly become involved in a voting rights meeting. The names of some of the people were people who would never participate in a voting rights meeting. But nevertheless, they listed everybody, and it was names of over 100. I thought of an idea that could satisfy the ministers who were enjoined for the 3 people or more, but who would be too afraid to openly violate the injunction, and at the same time to give a message to the congregation of how intense the white community was in objecting to the registration of blacks and what they must do by organizing to defeat them and their efforts to stop blacks from becoming registered voters. So, and this being done without the ministers publicly espousing that idea. So what I did was to prepare a letter written to every minister in Selma requesting that he, on a date certain, like the following Sunday, that he does not show up in church, but he allows his associate pastor to be the one who conducts the service. And he stays at home. That way, he was not in violation of the injunction, but by the same token, there is a stern message given to the congregation about what this is all about. Well, I and some of the SNCC participants went to each one of the churches, and I had that Saturday, in preparing the letters, I had run them off at my father-in-law's, who was a minister's, home. And there must have been 30 or 40 of such letters. I ran them off on his mimeograph machine, and because of the length of time it took, I also had a couple of drinks to warm me as I was just participating in writing the letters. Well, I suppose I had that on my breath a little bit. I wasn't drunk or anything like that. But as we had finished delivering the letters, I was arrested. And I was arrested for DUI. As a matter of fact, they took me to the city jail in Selma, and present at the time was Attorney J.L. Chestnut. And I was just obedient and compliant with whatever they wanted. They put me in a cell for about 2 hours, and then I was released. But they were supposed to have kept me for 8 hours. Excuse me.
No problem.
I was told by Attorney Chestnut that they thought that my arrest would be so embarrassing to me that I would go home and stay the rest of the time. But to give you an idea of the spirit and the attitude of my parents in their fight for blacks to have a right to vote, my father was conducting a 4th congressional voting rights meeting, which was our congressional district, at the First Baptist Church in Selma on this day. And I, from being released from jail, immediately went to the church and spoke. Well, it wasn't long before the federal court had dissolved that injunction.
I know there was another incident that happened, Mr. Boynton, during your time while you were living in Chattanooga, but still heavily involved in activities in Alabama.
Right.
And this was when you were, this related to the Freedom Rides and a trip up Highway 31, and you know which one I'm referencing.
Right. I had come home and I had traveled to Montgomery for some business reason and to visit with my aunt. And I decided that I would leave from Montgomery to drive back to Chattanooga. And the way that one would do that is to take Highway 31 here in Montgomery to Birmingham and then to change to a highway further north. Well, this was about 2 o'clock in the morning as I was driving, and I had cut on my favorite jazz radio station called Moonglow with Martin. And though I was the only person riding in the car, I felt that I had complete company with the music that was playing. Well, I was approaching the city of Alabaster, Alabama, when I wanted to pass a car, it's a double-lane highway, but this car was driving in the right-hand parking lane, and about a foot of the automobile was over in the second lane. I wanted to pass the car, but so I blinked several times to let the driver know that I was there to pass. He slowly moved over, and as I passed the automobile, I noticed it was a deputy sheriff. So I went on with the passing, and at the first traffic light in the city, the light was red against me. So I stopped in obedience of the light, and the deputy drove up to me and beckoned for me to follow him. I followed him to the city hall, which also was the city jail. And he told me he was going to write me a ticket for passing in a no passing lane. He asked to see my driver's license. Well, Tennessee carried driver's license that also on it was your profession. So my driver's license said I was attorney at law. When he saw that, he asked to search my car. Well, at that hour of the morning, and with nothing to hide, I gave him the keys to the car and agreed that he should search it. I accompanied him back to the car, at which time it dawned upon me that I had stopped on my way down to Selma here in Birmingham and met with a person by the name of J. Richmond Pearson, who later has become a circuit court judge there in Birmingham. But Tennessee had forbade us to have quickie divorces, but Alabama still allowed such. So I wanted to send down to him clients of mine who were in need of a quick divorce. And he agreed and gave me a form called a waiver form where a defendant would sign that, waiving his right to take testimony and all of those type of things. And the form carried an identification of the court. It said, in the circuit court of Jefferson County, Alabama. I had just simply put the forms in the glove compartment. And I thought about that when the deputy sat on the front seat and opened the glove compartment. He did come up with the forms, and I could see his thought process went from 2 plus 2 to equaling 8. And the next thing I knew, he had gotten out of the car, forced my hand behind my back, and pushed me back into the jail and put me in a cell. I remained there not knowing why I had been arrested until about 7 o'clock that morning, when I overheard him talking to one of his fellow officers that he had nabbed himself a freedom rider. I looked around, and I was the only one that was in the cell. But I found out that he had charged me with not just passing in a no passing zone, but assault and battery on him. I also found out that they were holding court on me that day, that they found the judge at a laundromat, and he had come, and I was present before him. And before we got started, when I found out what the charges were, I asked him what type of punishment would I receive if found guilty. And the judge began to tell me about the several months in jail. I then asked him to allow me to talk with a lawyer, and I called attorney Ozell Billingsley in Birmingham and explained to him what was going on. He then asked to speak with the judge, and the two of them spoke for a while, and then the judge told me that I could plead guilty to assault, and he would fine me $50, which I did at that time and got the heck out of Alabaster. I have since gone back and asked the clerk of municipal court if she could find a copy of the proceedings, and she claimed that it was so far back that it would be very difficult to locate one. But I wanted it for my book, because it did occur.
This would have been around May of 1961, I believe. Is that?
Right. Actually, yes, what it was is that the Freedom Riders were attacked at the Birmingham bus station. That would have been May the 18th. I believe May the 18th or May the 17th, 1961.
Mr. Boynton, there was a number of cases you handled after returning to Selma around 1966 that we'll touch on, but originally one of the activities you were involved in when you returned was assisting in a corporation that I believe had been formed between your mother, Miss Amelia Boynton Robinson, along with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I wanted to ask if you could briefly describe that corporation.
Yes, my mother was interested in forming some type of organization, which became this corporation, but something that could result in the employment of local blacks, and particularly local blacks who had lost their job in demonstrating to become registered voters. Even though the voting rights bill had been passed, they still would be out of work. And what she did was convince Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to give $10,000 of his honorarium for being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And she contributed $10,000. Oh, no, hold on just a minute.
It may have been
5,000, yes, right, 5,000. Each one contributed 5,000, which made 10,000.
Yes, sir.
For the corpus of new corporation that was set up just for that purpose, and that purpose alone. One of the things that we did was I became the attorney for the group, and one of the first things I did was to ask them where was the $10,000 that they had raised, and they said that it was in the bank. I explained that the bank was the very place that had been financing the resistance to their movement, and they should be allowing it to use their money. So they agreed the best thing to do would be to purchase some land with the 10,000, and they bought 50 acres of land, which later on, because of the difficulty that we had in actually raising more money that would have been necessary for a garment factory, and people just didn't buy shares, that later on, and this is just a few years ago, that property was sold for $50,000. So it was a good investment.
Good return on investment.
Right,
there. Yes,
right.
sir. In 1967, or around that year, you had a case that you were assigned to handle in Monroeville, Alabama, and I believe this was the first instance in which an African-American attorney in Alabama had become a special prosecutor for the state. And I wanted to ask you to tell about that case.
Yes, it was my first appearance as special prosecutor for the state. And it involved a black young man of about 21, 22 years of age, who had been driving his automobile down a dirt road in Monroe County, Alabama. Actually, it was close to Monroeville. The mayor of Monroeville was standing outside his automobile, and this is all on a dirt road, when the young man came by. He passed the mayor, and his automobile threw up some gravel on the mayor. The young man didn't notice that and went on about his business. Later on that day, he drove by a store that was called the Commissary, which was a general produce store from groceries to everything else. And he saw the mayor, who was with two other white men. And the mayor beckoned for him to come over to where he was. They were not inside the commissary. They were under a large oak tree on the side of the commissary. He went to see what the mayor wanted and was attacked by all three and very badly beaten. He arranged, with the help of the local black militants there in Monroeville, he arranged for a arrest warrant to be issued against the mayor. And the mayor was arrested, so that I became the special prosecutor on the case against the mayor.
Mr. Boynton, if I can interject one detail, I believe the young man had to be hospitalized after the beating as well. Is that right?
Oh, yes, he did have to be. He was that badly beaten. And I had a problem, well, not in this case, because at this time, the juries were not only all white, they were all male. There were no white women on the jury. But my problem was trying a case where you knew that the jury was going to come back not guilty. And that did happen, but I was the first time that a black attorney had been a special prosecutor. Now, one of the fringe benefits of that case is that it resulted in the desegregation of the Monroe County Circuit Court. The courtroom was not the original one where the To Kill a Mockingbird had been filmed. The county had built a new courthouse, and it had a balcony just like the old one where blacks sat. Now, when I arrived at the courthouse, all of the blacks who were enthused about the case were waiting for me, standing outside the courtroom, outside the courthouse. When I got out of my car and started to enter the courthouse, I told them I did not want to see anybody black sitting in the balcony. They all sat on the first floor for that case, and that desegregated that county's courtroom. Now, the judge was Robert E. Lee Keith, who was quite a conservative person. I don't think he forgave me for desegregating his courtroom after many years. But what was I going to say? But that was the result of that case.
So positive outcome despite the not guilty
Right.
verdict by the
Right.
Mr. Boynton, I believe around 1967, there was another case that I wanted to ask you about, and that's one where I believe you represented Mr. Stokely Carmichael and Mr. Willie Ricks.
Oh, yes. That one arose one spring day. One Sunday, I had gone fishing, and when I came back home, I had a telephone call from Stokely who said that they were in the middle of a gun battle. The call came from Prattville, Alabama. And what he explained was that he was involved in a gun battle with the local police, and he was running out of bullets, and the Army had a tank that they were bringing in, and he asked, what should he do? And I said, surrender, which is what he did do, fortunately, before anyone lost their life. But what had occurred to reach the point of the shootout was that earlier that day, there had been a mass meeting that had been held there in Prattville. And that was about voting rights. Let's see, it could have been voting rights. I'm not sure what it was about, because this would have been 68. I'm not sure what
a civil rights matter there.
Right, it was a civil rights matter. But one of the white police officers walked to the front of the church and just announced to everybody, y'all go home. And a black woman stood up and said, you go home and see if I'm there. And I guess they had some more words, but that was the end of the involvement of the police at the church. But then, later on that day, I don't know if it was the same officer who had been at the church or another police officer, but he was on regular patrol when somebody with a shotgun shot a blast into the windshield of the automobile. None of the shots injured the officer, but the blast itself caused him to lose control of the automobile. It went into a tree and knocked him unconscious. From there, the law enforcement moved to the house where they knew that was the headquarters for Stokely, and the shootout occurred. And that was what was going on. Actually, the next day, for me to present a bond for all of the participants, because beside it being Willie Ricks, there were about 10 young black men. But as I made the bond for Stokely and others, at that time, there was a flatbed truck that had about 10 white men who were sitting on the truck, and the National Guard had been called in reference to the appearance of that tank. And that day when the bonds were being made, there was a colonel from the National Guards who was there. And he and I both expressed concern about the white men on the flatbed truck. What he concluded to do, because there was an alleyway on the opposite side of the courthouse leading from the jail to the street, and if one took that way, the people on the truck would not even see the departure of Stokely and the people. So Stokely and the group all departed by going down the alleyway in their automobile, followed by the National Guard and with their armaments, followed by the news people with their television cameras. And when I looked around, I saw that I was the only one left, and the whites on the flatbed truck were still there. I was the only one there with the bondsman. But we also departed the same way and got away without any problems. Now, some months passed before that case came up to be resolved. In the meantime, Stokely had left and gone to Africa to marry a person who had been an outstanding movie star, and she was an outstanding vocalist, recording star. Miriam Makeba was her name. And they were scheduled to get married at the same time that the case was scheduled to come up with Stokely. I went to the judge and explained that I was really asking for a continuance, that Stokely would be in Africa getting married at the time that his case was scheduled, and would he give me a continuance of a sort. And he says, well, Bruce, if you promise me that Stokely Carmichael will never come back to Watauga County, I'll dismiss the case. I said, well, you got that, Judge. You got a promise. Actually, that was done, so to speak. Years later, I was over in Prattville and decided to look at the court record to see how the case was finally resolved. And even though there was a shootout and all of that, the case was resolved against Stokely for disorderly conduct and a fine of $25. So that's how that one was resolved.
You had another case, I believe, that followed that one by not too long, also in the late 1960s, representing Mr. James Austin in Camden, Alabama, and I wanted to ask you about that one as well.
Yes. Well, I had been representing a young black man about 20 years of age in Sheffield, Alabama, which is a northern section of the state. He was charged with 2 cases of murder where he had shot and killed two brothers. They were co-workers of his. All three were employed for the city cemetery, and they were cleaning up things of a sort. But what happened, the other two whites were people who were constantly after him, agitating him because he was black. He finally had gotten so tired of the way that they treated him, including calling him Florida Sunshine and destroying his lunches and everything, that he told them that the next time that they bothered him, he was going to shoot and kill them. They did act into that, and he left the cemetery, caught a white cab, went home, looked for his gun and for his bullets around the house, found them, loaded his weapon, placed it in his waistband, and came back to work. He kept the cab waiting to bring him back to work. And sure enough, they started in after him again. He pulled his pistol and he shot both of them to death. He then went down to the county jail and surrendered himself. And that was a case that I was involved in the defense. And I was defending the defendant on the grounds of insanity caused by white racism. And I had a black psychiatrist from Atlanta, Georgia, who created the slogan, "Black is beautiful, it's so beautiful to be black," as his defense witness. And we went through the life and the exposure of that young man, and one could easily see that he was a victim in his life of white racism. But I was so involved with that case that James Austin, who lived in Selma, but who had friends and relatives in Wilcox County, the next county over, and one of the worst counties in the state of Alabama racially, had been there seeking to register, again, I don't remember why, but something involving civil rights, because he had copied some of Martin Luther King's speech from the "I Have a Dream" speech. And I do remember seeing him on television, on the news, reciting a portion of that speech. But they had arrested him, and I'm not sure what it was for now. And I do know that I kept putting off seeing about going down and getting a bond for him, because I was so tied up in the North Alabama case. So finally there was a break that presented itself in that case, and I explained to the SNCC workers who served as my bodyguards and as a driver that the James Austin Day had come, and we was go down there and get him out of jail, even though I knew that we have a hard time with law enforcement there. Wilcox County is just such a county. It was akin to Dallas County with the Sheriff Jim Clark that we had, and a lot of men had been killed in the county jail. And I knew that, And I certainly didn't want that to happen to James. Well, I went down to the courthouse to get a bond form to take out in the community to get someone that James knew to sign the bond. Actually, that's the way that it was done at that time. You could get a form from the sheriff's department and they go out, have it signed, and the sheriff then would check to see if they had enough property to be released on the signature of the signee. Well, there was nobody in the sheriff's office, so I couldn't get a bond form, but I waited for about an hour, and a chief deputy, or the chief deputy, showed up, and I told him that I wanted a bond form. He then explained to me where he had been, and he said that he had been someplace in the county because the black students were protesting and objecting to the fact that they had to go a long ways on mileage to school on the bus. And I know that he said that, and he said it that way to get me to reply. If I objected to him, I was asking for an argument with him, with me in his jail. If I agreed with him, then he would consider me just an acceptable Negro. So I thought that I would go an oblique way and try to turn it off into humor. So I said, well, shit, Sheriff, the way black kids are nowadays, it's a wonder they didn't grab you. He turned red, expressed a little bit of anger on his face, but he gave me the form and I left. That was at the courthouse where the sheriff's office was. When I came back after having the bond signed, I went to the courthouse and I was so intent on getting a bond executed for James that I didn't pay attention to obvious signs that something was amiss. I ignored the fact that at the front of the jail, near the parking space, the sidewalk, there was the clerk of the court. And we had been gone for over an hour, so she had to be there for a long time waiting for me. But she was waiting for me to tell me that the sheriff wanted to see me at the jail. I ignored that and went to the jail. When we drove up and parked, there was the sheriff, the chief deputy, and one black trustee with a shotgun. Across the street were about 13 whites, and they had guns. And I recognized that we were in a trap at that time, even though I will admit that I had weapons too. But at that point, there was no way that any type of shootout could have satisfactorily occurred. So I got out of the car, went up to the sheriff, and said that I understood he wanted to see me. The sheriff says, I understand that you've been cursing in my office. I said, well, I remember what I said, but I thought that among men it was just a joke. There were no children, anybody there to be offended. I said, but I do apologize in case that should not have been said. He said, what, Boynton? You've been cursing in my office? Why, kill that SOB. Kill that MF. And he went into a screaming fit to kill me. The chief deputy pulled his chief special, 38 Smith & Wesson, just like the one I had, and started waving it around, claiming he would kill me right then and there. I had on a white linen suit, a straw hat, and shades. And I used to smoke back at that time, and I was smoking a cigarette. So I decided to be calm and prepare to be shot in the stomach. And I continued to smoke the cigarette and try to exhibit calmness as much as possible. After about 2 or 3 minutes of the screaming, the chief deputy put his gun back in his holster. And he then said, God damn it, I'll kill you now. And he slapped me. And he slapped me very fiercely. So much so that the sound of the slap caused the sheriff to quit screaming, to kill me. He was silent. There was nothing but silence from both of them. I then told the sheriff that I was going to go back in the jail and see my client. I asked him if I could, but I went without a reply. And I didn't go back in to see the client. I just went to a corner and finished smoking my cigarette. I then lit another cigarette, and I told the client no details of what had occurred outside. I just said, it'll take tomorrow to get you out of jail. And I went back outside. We got back in our automobile, and we left. We safely departed Camden. I called several black people, but nobody seemed to want to go back to Camden with me at 1 o'clock the next day. There was one minister who asked what could he do, but when I told him I was going back because my client was in jail, he didn't offer any more help. But there were SNCC people who had been Vietnam veterans who were coming from as far away as 50, 60 miles or more. And they were going to accompany me. A couple of them were cooking explosives, plastic explosives, on my kitchen stove. And I called first the governor of the state. Lurleen Wallace had died, and she had been replaced by Governor Brewer. And I spoke with Governor Brewer, explained to him what had happened, And I said, it's clear that they want to kill me, but I'm going back. And I wonder whether or not you can provide me some protection. He said, no, we can't give you any protection. I said, well, I'm going back anyway at 1 o'clock. And I'll have some black men with me as bodyguards. And that while I will promise you, we're not going to start anything. I can't promise you that there won't be anything going on. I then called the FBI or the Justice Department, and I was asking for FBI protection. And I got a reply that they could come with me and as observers, but they couldn't offer any protection. And I told them that I didn't need anybody to just observe how I died. Well, we were getting ready to come to Camden. Oh, incidentally, my sheriff, Wilson Baker, who had replaced Sheriff Jim Clark by an election of black votes, that Baker was now the sheriff, and I had gotten the gun permit from him. He called me and canceled my gun permit. But I explained to him that in Alabama, you can openly carry a weapon. The permit was for a concealed weapon, and that it was summertime, I think it was in June, and I said that I would not have it concealed, somebody can see it. We were getting ready to go back to Camden when who came walking down the street but James Austin. He didn't know why he was released. He was just told to go to my house before 1 o'clock. And that's what occurred. We did not have to go to Camden.
Shortly after that case, I believe you actually moved to Washington, D.C., where you had gone to law school at Howard University. Right. And spent some time up there, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about that move. Right. And that transition.
Well, that's true. Because nobody seemed to have been concerned about what occurred to me in Camden, I decided that perhaps I need to take another look at just how devoted I am to black people and their rights, and what can happen to me with nobody caring. And I decided that I would try going to Washington, D.C. and just looking at the situation through different eyes. And that's what I did do. I went to Washington, and I ended up with a job that it was basically from my mother's classmate, who then had been the secretary of assistant secretary of education during the Johnson administration. And his partner in the corporation was a person, Dr. Francis Gregory, who had been the Director of Operation Manpower for the Department of Labor. Now, being Democrats and in the Johnson administration, when Richard Nixon was elected, they automatically had submitted their resignation for both positions. But what they wanted to do was to set up this corporation to take advantage, like other people who are high officials with the federal government, to use the contact and everything that they have made and to be able to make a living, make a profit out of having such high positions. Now, there were two other people who were involved in the corporation, and I explained to you their relevancy. There was Melvin Laird was the Secretary of Defense, and we had his niece on the board of directors. And also, we had a white former FBI agent who was a friend of the major drummer of Howard Hughes. This person was a friend of a former FBI agent, but he became a major drummer of Howard Hughes. The reason for his involvement was that with Dr. Gregory being familiar with the Labor's Department of Manpower, that Howard Hughes was then considering selling one of his casinos. And we would purchase the casino and then have blacks to not only run it, but to teach other blacks how to run a casino through the Department of Manpower. Well, we also had, with Dr. Bryce and his connection with the Department of Labor, we had Tuskegee Alumni Housing Association. That was a housing program that would be built under HUD with the various alumni associations of Tuskegee around the country being the sponsor for apartments to be built under the HUD programs. And we were successful. While I was there, in the building of one that had been completed. But all of that was housed in a spank brand new tall apartment building on 17th Street that went to Connecticut Avenue downtown. The third floor would house Tuskegee Alumni Housing Foundation. The curtains, the carpet, and other things in the office were done in Tuskegee's color of crimson and gold. Upstairs on the 5th floor was Warner and Warner International Associates. And that was done in a powder blue decor for the draperies and the carpet. Now, we ended up involved with Mr. Wilson, who owned Holiday Inns, and 6 West African countries with an idea of developing their beaches for a resort in each one of the countries, with the country itself owning at least 51% of the operation. And that was done through an AIDS program with Richard Nixon. And incidentally, when the group went over to Africa for the first time, we couldn't go. I didn't go at all, but the group couldn't go, according to Richard Nixon, unless Mr. Johnson of Johnson Publication, Ebony Magazine, Jet Magazine, were put on the trip to go with us, because he owed Mr. Johnson this trip for a political payback. And he did go. But at some point, Richard Nixon pulled out and decided that we should not be able to carry out the program that the program was designed for. But we did get involved in several other things. One thing that we were involved with was the liquor business. We are one of our co-workers and very dear friends of ours was Rashid Holloway. And Rashid had been like a minister of trade for his country of Sierra Leone. And Rashid was one of the most unusual Africans you ever did see. He was olive brown complexion, black wavy hair. He was an All-American soccer player at Ohio State. He got his PhD from Oxford University. He taught at Cambridge. His father was a diamond merchant, and he was a very dear friend of mine. And his cousin lost out to Harry Belafonte for a movie that starred Dorothy Dandridge and Joan Fontaine. And I forgot who the male lead was beside them. But it was dealing with the first interracial love affair of the 4 of them. And Sir John Carr, who had been knighted by his cousin by the Queen of England, had become the ambassador to the United States. And we had that type of contact. That was Rashid's cousin. And he actually got him to resign from being the ambassador because his president of Sierra Leone had been a person who was no good, who was about to declare himself to be the president for life. And Rashid after talking Sir John into resigning. Also left the company about the same time as I left. I left to come back to Alabama. But, and Rashid left to teach at Morehouse University. But while we were there, we had an idea brought by a black guy from New York City to go into the liquor business. He had actually bottled and packaged a brand of scotch that he called Soul Brother Scotch. And his money had become limited for the marketing of the product. He had given Sammy Davis Jr. and a lot of other black celebrities large amounts of shares of stock, like 50,000 shares of stock, to promote the Soul Brother Scotch. And he came to us, he heard about this Dynamite Black Corporation in downtown Washington. And I made the suggestion that we not try to breathe life into his corporation, which would then automatically make the celebrities very wealthy. But we'll start off again with our corporation, bringing him in, because we're not trying to steal his idea, but bringing him in for a suitable amount of compensation and go from there. As a matter of fact, Rashid came up with the name for the product, the Amistad brand, which is based on the ship that the slaves took over and sailed it to America. But we were busy trying to raise money for going into the liquor business. I had found that there was a company in Baltimore, Maryland, that for $500, they would bottle your liquor, and instead of the label stating that it was bottled for your company, it would state that it was bottled by your company, so that you couldn't tell by looking at it that one wasn't done by your distillery. The Rashid knew about scotch, and even that you could buy scotch by the barrels, and they would keep it and hold it in their warehouses for the aging of the product, and you could then sell it back to them and all of that. But anyway, we had an idea. And the question was, how much money would it take for us to begin selling a product on the East Coast? And while we were dealing with that, along came two men to one of the meetings that Rashid and I never found out how they happened to know about the meetings. One was an accountant, the other was a taxi driver. But they attended the meetings. They seemed to have been acceptable with Dr. Bryce and Dr. Gregory, but they seemed to be participating as shareholders or something in the corporation. But anyway, the next day I knew, one of the Washington Post dailies stated that a wholesale liquor store agent arrested for bootlegging. And what had happened is that they had taken my idea with the company in Baltimore, Maryland, and I had explained that the company would charge only a commission if we could guarantee $10,000 a month sales and all of that. And apparently they liked the idea so much that they went to the company, stole our ideas, and actually did bottle a liquor called Amistad brand. I think it was a vodka, including the idea that we had for the label and all. Well, they had the liquor, but then they didn't have any place to warehouse it except in the accountant's basement. And then they didn't have any sales for the liquor, so they decided to sell it retail to anybody who came in. And that got them to the label of being bootleggers and being arrested. Well, after a while, I decided that I would prefer practicing law and came back to Alabama. But incidentally, though, I would like to say that Dr. Francis Gregory, two things about him. One, he became the foster father of Colonel Penn's daughter. Colonel Penn was the officer who was coming from his military obligations in the Army, and then going through the state of Georgia, he was shot and killed, and by whites. And Dr. Gregory's son, Gregory, I can't think of his first name right now, but Dr. Gregory's son was the first black astronaut, not the astronaut who was killed on a return trip from outer space. He was supposedly scheduled to depart from a rocket ship as the next flight after the ones who were killed on the launching pad. And because of that, because of the death of those astronauts, they skipped over Dr. Gregory's son, and he became then a pilot for the shuttlecraft. He was the first black astronaut, not the one that news people give to the one that was killed on a return trip. Okay.
Mr. Boynton, when you did return back to Selma around 1972, 1973, I know you continued to handle civil rights cases through the state for the years that followed. And I wanted to note specifically that ultimately you became the first African-American county attorney for Dallas County. And I wanted to ask you about that experience.
Right, for about 12 years. The position became available to me after Dallas County had a majority black county commission so that they could appoint whoever they wanted to. Now, actually, I think I have still been the only black attorney, county attorney, here in the state of Alabama. But one of the cases that stand out with me is a case involving the painting of a courthouse. The courthouse began to leak in various places, and a company was hired from there in Selma to repaint it, but paint it in a waterproof type of paint. The paint did not take at all, and I had to sue the contractor, and I used a professional expert witness who was from the state of Georgia and who had testified in a case involving a paint job gone awry on a Mercedes, if I'm not sure, if not mistaken, who resulted in a very large sum. And I got him to be our expert. And I remember that we won the case. The contractor did do a proper job after he was told what he should have been doing and all, and the courthouse looks very good now.
One of many aspects of your legacy. And Mr. Boynton, I know our time is up here, but thank you so much for doing this. And if I could just conclude my part by conveying to you that this has been truly both humbling and inspiring for me to get to be a part of. And thank you again for all you've done and for doing this.
Well, I'm very happy to have participated, and certainly very happy to have been here. So that's it.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.